Wavelength.
Mental illness doesn't have to be a life sentence.
Alcohol addiction, abuse, misuse is the same all over the globe.
Sparking the combos about Adelaide.
So it made me feel very confident that if we did have it in the state, we were going to know about it.
You should be having.
There'll be guys that are trained, but they don't feel like they're good enough to take their shirt off.
Almost everyone is a culprit of doom scrolling. Anyone who has a mobile phone.
On Fresh 92.7.
Welcome to Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having. I'm your host, David, and this beautiful Monday, I am joined by the beautiful Jamie.
Hello, how are we going?
We are going really well. How was your weekend?
My weekend was awesome. I had some great things happening. Saw some mates, got a bit of sun, went to the farmers markets.
Oh, that
so
is
wholesome.
The best weekend.
I know. I just felt like being wholesome this weekend.
Oh, I'm so happy for you.
What about you?
I finished my 1 month of sobriety on Saturday.
Mazel tov on the big day.
Oh, it was a massive night.
Are you a new man? Is it true what they say? Does it actually make you feel better if you don't drink?
It makes you feel incredible. I mean, it's definitely not for everyone. I did this for my own sanity. I'm not trying to be better than anyone else. I was terrible at drinking. And I feel amazing.
Well, I mean, you're always glowing, but maybe you've got that extra bit of glow now about you. It's your glow up.
My pregnancy. Yeah. Anyway, Jamie, how about you tell us a bit about what's on the show tonight?
Tonight on Wavelength, does stopping sexual assault begin in the classroom? With all the allegations of sexual assault in Canberra coming out in the past couple of weeks, we're wondering if our schools need to be doing more.
Wavelength is also going to explain the latest scandal to hit our defence force, but next, we're asking, should we just legalise all drugs? You're listening to Fresh.
Wavelength.
Welcome back to Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having. I'm David, and I'm joined with Jamie tonight. And Jamie, so the ACT is currently exploring whether possession of a number of drugs like MDMA, heroin, and LSD should be decriminalised. Like us here in SA, they've already decriminalised the possession of cannabis, but should we be going further here in SA?
I spoke with Michael Pettersson from the ACT Legislative Assembly about their proposed changes to drug legalisation.
Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
Hey, boys and girls, let's talk about drugs. Or more importantly, let's talk about the decriminalisation of illicit drugs within Australia. As the ACT sets to decriminalise a variety of illicit drugs, should South Australia follow suit? In February of this year, a bill was introduced in the ACT to decriminalise the possession of small amounts of hard drugs. Ecstasy, heroin, psilocybin, meth and cocaine are amongst those plans to be decriminalised if the bill passes. As SA stands at present, possession of drugs of dependence or prohibited substances can occur a maximum penalty of $2,000 or imprisonment for up to 2 years, or both, whilst larger quantities can attract a maximum penalty of up to $500,000 or 15 years imprisonment to life, or both. Are these laws getting stale and crusty, and do these laws reflect the way society's changing? I talk with Michael Pettersson, part of the Labor MLA Act Legislative Assembly, and the backbencher who has tabled the bill to decriminalise these drugs.
My name is Michael Pettersson. I'm a Labor member for Yerrabee in the ACT Legislative Assembly.
Describe to me this bill and what it entails.
I've introduced a private member's bill to the ACT Legislative Assembly to decriminalise the possession of small amounts of some illicit substances. The reason I'm doing this is because I don't think treating drug use as a criminal problem is the best way to go about reducing the harms in our society. If we want to reduce the harms of drugs in our society, we need to start treating it like a health problem. What I'm proposing is that we introduce smaller thresholds that would be considered decriminalised amounts. If you're caught with those smaller amounts, you'd be eligible for a fine and referral to an education or medical program.
What is the process of passing a bill like this?
That's a very good question, and I think one that not enough people know and understand. I'm a backbencher, so I've introduced a private member's bill. This isn't official government business. What happens as a private member when I introduce a bill is it's considered by my colleagues and then referred off to a committee of my fellow parliamentarians. They'll ask for submissions from the public, they'll write a report, then ultimately it comes back to the Legislative Assembly where all the politicians get together, debate it, and then vote on it.
What benefits does decriminalising illicit drugs have on the community?
Profoundly beneficial. At the moment, under our current prohibition approach to these substances, individuals are having their lives ruined with criminal conviction. Caught with a small amount of these illicit substances, criminally prosecuted and convicted, criminal record can stop you getting certain jobs, can limit your housing choices, limit your ability to travel overseas. So even if there's no medical consequences and you're just caught with small amounts, you can still ruin your life. If, of course, you use one of these substances, and these substances are dangerous, it makes it harder for these people to come forward and seek help. If you've used one of these substances and you're in the process of potentially overdosing, for some people, a life or death decision is made whether or not they call for an ambulance, call for help, but they're scared of the criminal repercussions. At the moment, I would say our drug laws are not effective. By any measure, they're not doing a good job. 1 in 3 of us have used cannabis, 12% of us have used ecstasy, 6% of us have used meth. This is after years and years of prohibition. So the idea that our drug laws are stopping people from using right now doesn't really hold much water. I think it's time for a new approach. I want to acknowledge that drugs are dangerous, and I don't want people to be using drugs. I want to find ways that we can reduce the use of drugs and the harms of drugs in our society. Now, current laws haven't really done that. Drug use is common. I think most people know someone that's used drugs. So if we want to go about reducing the harms and the use of these substances, we actually need to stop and reflect on what actually will do that. Now, I think having an open and honest conversation about drugs is probably the best way to do it. Public education first and foremost. Also making available all of the medical supports that are required. If someone wants to go to rehab, they shouldn't have to wait several months to do it.
What can people do to support South Australia in following suit? So what can, your everyday person like myself do?
That is a really good question, and I think the short and simple answer is to get involved. I don't really care how you get involved, but you should get involved. There's a whole range of organisations, community groups, activist groups where you can go, be involved and help make change in the world.
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
That there was Jamie chatting with Michael Pettersson about the decriminalisation of a number of drugs like heroin, coke, meth, basically everything.
All of the hard drugs, all the Class A drugs.
Right, okay. In the ACT specifically.
Yes, yep. So it hasn't passed yet, but it's in the process of passing. And Michael Pettersson actually, so the ACT just passed a successful bill last year, and that was to decriminalise cannabis. So something like this has already happened. Mm-hmm. I really liked talking with Michael. He was a really great person to give some good insight onto a little bit more about the bill and opening up this conversation about decriminalising such illicit drugs. Mm-hmm. And it is like, he said it's all about education and having these open and honest conversations about it, which, as a society we haven't really done. It's kind of just been like put a Band-Aid solution over this problem.
Totally.
Turn it into a public healthcare issue instead of just like a criminal one, right? Like
totally.
It totally makes sense. And this bill is about helping people and like bringing them up in the community instead of just bringing them down. And like, it's about like reform,
I mean, it's a radical way of rethinking how we deal with drug addiction in Australia because it's a massive problem.
Totally. And let's break down South Australia's drug use. SA is home to the highest average capital city consumption of methamphetamine. So we've got the biggest ice problem, Adelaide. And also, even things like cannabis consumption's also increased over the past couple of years. So drug use is going up.
Yeah, and this type of, I suppose, proposal in the ACT, it's not about letting people go nuts. It's about harm reduction. Like, we have to be realistic, don't we? Like, the war on drugs hasn't really worked.
No.
People still do drugs every weekend, every day. We need to change our approach, obviously. And I think we need to encourage people who are having problems with drugs to be able to reach out and get the help they need.
Absolutely. And this isn't condoning doing drugs at all.
Of course not, yeah.
It's just looking at it in a completely logical way, being like, what we've been doing isn't working.
Fantastic chat there, Jamie. After the break, though, we'll be cracking into our main story of the evening about teaching sexual consent in our classrooms. But right now, you're listening to Fresh 92.7.
Wavelength.
Welcome back to Wavelength with David and Jamie this evening, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having. Sexual consent. It's something our politicians seem to need to learn a bit about.
Lol, that's true. We've been reading them in the news lately.
Yeah.
But should the lessons be taught in our schools? And could an early intervention approach reduce violence against women from men later in their lives?
So in part one of this story, Hamish spoke to Chanel Contos about her push to have consent more widely taught in Australian schools. Chanel found prominence earlier this year when an Instagram poll she posted went viral, which revealed hundreds of testimonies from former Sydney schoolgirls about sexual assaults they had experienced at the hands of their male peers.
Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
The word consent isn't even in the Australian curriculum. I'm trying to get it in there right now.
In the last few months, the conversation around sexual abuse and how we combat it seems to only be growing louder and louder, and rightfully so. But does the battle begin in our classrooms? The Victorian government seems to think so, making consent classes a mandatory part of the curriculum from next term. This week, I spoke with activist Chanel Contos, who has been a prominent voice in this conversation recently. She guided me through exactly why it's so important we expand our current sexual education curriculum and why we need to start having real conversations about sexual abuse as early as possible.
My name's Chanel Contos. I started a petition that calls for more holistic and earlier consent education in Australia. This is because I've noticed this culture where sexual assault just is the norm amongst our youth, and I decided to do something about it.
Yeah, you launched that petition which called to teach consent among a number of other things as well in schools' sexual education curriculum, and that really took off. It amassed 30,000 signatures, and now the Victorian government has decided that they're going to implement consent classes across the state. So how do you feel about that? Do you feel that's a big step forward?
So what's great is that Victoria's committed for term 2 consent education to be mandatory and explicit in the curriculum and taught in schools. However, I'm working with the Department of Education on a more long-term curriculum, and they seem very receptive to adopting things like victim blaming into the curriculum, healthy masculinity, power imbalances between young boys and young girls, female sexuality.
You've called for a sex ed revolution. What exactly do you mean by that?
If Australian youth receive consent education, it's often just the definition of what sexual assault is and, the criminal sentencing for it. But what we need to start talking about is how sexual assault is so prevalent. We need to talk about the fact that for some reason our society has made toxic masculinity mainstream masculinity. We need to start teaching boys about what healthy masculinity is so that they can use that to be the best young men they can be. At the same time, we need to teach girls that, sexual assault is very prevalent. We need to teach them that your boyfriend can sexually assault you. We need to teach them that oral sex counts as sexual assault. We need to teach them that they are shamed for their sexuality because of the nature of our society, but that is not the right thing. We need to teach them that if they are sexually assaulted, the reality of the situation is that we live in a victim-blaming society at the moment, and although all signs point to it's your fault, you need to know that if you are sexually assaulted, it is never your fault. We need to change the model from no means no to yes means yes. No means no is so problematic because the way that girls are socialised means that it's really, really hard for them to say no. You may not be able to say the word no because you're too scared in that moment. And even though you may feel that you were sexually assaulted, the court system would not see that as sexual assault because they would say you never said no to him. How is he meant to know you didn't want to have sex with him?
What kind of gaps do you see in our sexual education curriculum at the moment?
The gaps are everywhere. The gap is it happens too late. If consent is taught in schools, it usually comes in around year 10. 50% of them have already had sex. So it is too late. It is like teaching someone how to drive after they've been given a car and put them on the road. Kids have sex more casually and younger than ever before. Having an open conversation about sexuality in culture in classrooms with teachers, with students, it leads to later average ages of first sexual activity and reduces the rate of teen sex. 12 and 13-year-olds are watching pornography, so if we're not going to teach them about sex, then their only form of education comes from pornography, and we can all see how problematic that is. They're curious. They want to know.
Yeah.
And they need to know. And these things happen to them. These girls are so appreciative that they're getting these conversations. These boys are shocked at the things they're hearing about them. The Australian youth is begging for this. They literally are.
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
That there was Hamish chatting with Chanel Contos, who is proposing a sex ed revolution.
Yes, let's talk about the sex ed revolution.
It's very exciting. And she, like I said before, she came to prominence because of an Instagram poll which really just highlighted how many schoolgirls in Sydney had been victimised by, or had suffered from sexual assault.
Absolutely. And, if you see that, that's one little small school that's happening everywhere in Australia, right? Such an important thing. And it starts with education, y'all. It starts with teaching kids sex education in schools and consent culture, because it is a conversation that should be had by people at a really young age. Because, talking about consent culture is not only talking about the sexual harassment side of it. It's talking about learning boundaries and understanding those boundaries. And that's something that can be taught with kids at a really young age. It's so important.
Well, that's really interesting that you bring that up, because later on in the show, we're going to be talking to a couple of people from La Trobe University, and they're talking really about this new program that's being brought in Victoria, which starts really young. And it starts teaching about consent really young. And we'll get into that really soon. But I'm also really interested to hear, I guess, also from Chanel when she was talking about it's not just sexual consent that needs to be taught. It's about how men can still be masculine without being toxically masculine.
Totally.
And that's something that really plays a big part in these sexual assault cases.
Absolutely. Super, super, super important.
Well, thank you so much for that chat there, Hamish. Next, we're going to let you know what the hell has been going on this week. You guys are listening to Fresh.
Wavelength.
Welcome back to Wavelength. We'll be getting back into our story about sexual consent lessons in the classroom very soon, but now we're going to crack into our weekly segment where Hamish explains what the hell has happened this week.
What the hell is going on this week? Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
News was announced this week that SA now holds another unattractive record alongside the highest number of freeloaders and most bodies stored in barrels. We're now also the state with the slowest COVID rollout. The entire state is now expected to be vaccinated by the time the Adelaide Crows win their next premiership, so this could take some time. Famous voice actor Hank Azaria formally apologised to every Indian around the globe for his portrayal of Apu on The Simpsons, when really he should be apologising to all of us for the last 17 seasons of the show. The Liberal government proved that they really cannot go one single news week without making complete and utter asses of themselves when a group of female dancers were organised to twerk at the unveiling of a new Royal Navy ship. Now, when we asked for more women in politics, this is not what we meant, guys. We said less sexualisation of women. Less. Meanwhile, the rest of us were just happy that none of the party's backbenchers were anywhere nearby. And finally, cancel culture took over our feeds once again this week after some very special people demanded greater representation of cultures in the beloved ABC cartoon Bluey, an animated show about dogs. And all I have to say to those people is you stay the hell away from Bluey. That show is sacred and innocent and the only good thing left in this damn world, and if you sully it with your dirty accusations again...
I will look for you. I will find you. And I will kill you.
But it's also worth noting that we don't really know if anyone actually believes in these causes. This week, you may have also heard that some people want to rename fairy bread. Well, turns out some people were our lovely friends at the Chaser team, who fabricated the whole thing, created a fake petition, and got their subscribers to amass signatures for them. It was then promptly eaten up by the gullible suckers that are the News Corp media, who peddled it as gospel to the masses. So, moral of the story, don't believe everything you see on the internet. The radio, however, now that's a different story. No one could ever tell a lie live on air, right? Stay tuned for next week's show where we reveal who's calling for the colour yellow to be renamed and why.
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
Thanks for that, Hamish. Right now, you're listening to Fresh 92.7.
Wavelength.
Welcome back to Wavelength. Before the break, we heard from Hamish, who spoke with Chanel Contos.
But what model can we look to for lessons on sexual consent? In Victoria, they're about to roll out a new program called Respectful Relationships. It's a program that will see consent taught widely from a very young age and building up to lessons about sexual consent explicitly in high school.
But some teachers are apprehensive about it. So how do we get around those problems? I spoke with Kirsty Duncanson and Sharon O'Mara from La Trobe University about respectful relationships and how the curriculum is way better than the alternative.
Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
I am Kirsty Duncanson and I'm a senior lecturer in crime, justice and legal studies at La Trobe University.
My name's Sharon O'Mara. I'm a casual academic at La Trobe University.
The Victorian government has just announced that it will be making consent classes a mandatory part of the sex education curriculum across all schools from next week when the new term begins. I'm interested, first of all, is that a big step forward? And also, what kind of benefit could this actually end up having in battling cases of sexual assault?
I think it's a powerful move, making this explicit move and to be talking about what consent is, I think, has the potential to be really powerful. But it's that kind of how it can be taught and whether it's about sex. It can be so much more than just being about sex, because we can see in our interactions with very young children that consent is something that we don't often offer children, and we don't allow them to express, and we don't often respect it when they say no. So if you think about the kind of the rough play that people have with children or the tickling, that becomes really useful, because then once you get into an intimate moment with other people, then you can feel safer to say no and to feel that you have a right for that to be respected.
Earlier on, we spoke with Chanel Contos, and she's discussed her concerns that a lack of comprehensive sex education leads children to seek out pornography to educate themselves. I'm interested in your perspective on that take, and also what kind of damage can that lack of sex education and children turning to pornography, what kind of damage can that have on them?
Through the research, there was a lot of teachers that were concerned about the impact of pornography, but more broadly the sources of information that young people were accessing. And, you know, a recent Our Watch study found that by the age of 13, nearly 50% of boys have viewed pornography, and it's nearly 50% of girls by the age of 15. This mightn't all be intentional viewing of pornography, but of those who intentionally sought out pornography, the primary reason was curiosity. So 78% of those participants who intentionally sought out pornography did so because they were curious. So, I mean, this really points to the importance of education, that we need to be providing a rigorous, comprehensive curriculum, because young people are going to find other sources of information.
In your study, you were, and I guess also in that conversation article, you were talking about how teachers are, I guess, anxious to deliver this type of sex education, and also some were censoring parts of the curriculum that they deemed risky. I'm interested in where are these anxieties coming from, and what kind of content are they actively censoring, and what are they really afraid of? Is it just backlash from parents?
The study took place in light of the public scrutiny and the backlash over the Safe Schools program. They certainly spoke about complaints that had from parents. They'd spoken about ways that they would try and censor some of the curriculum, which is obviously quite concerning, because I spoke before how it's really important that this kind of curriculum doesn't just happen in the school setting. It's important for parents to come on board and to have conversations and support what's being learnt at school. Potentially at the end they might just tack on, the people also are involved in same-sex relationships. There's other ways relationships can occur, but it was about a male and female, because that was seen as less risky. And when I asked the teachers about that, you know, they said they tried to include the other content, but they really, you know, they were anxious. They felt concerned. They were aware of what could happen there, and they didn't, you know, want to be the focus of public scrutiny.
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
That was me speaking with Kirsty Duncanton and Sharon O'Mara from La Trobe University about the Victorian government's push to see sexual consent talk to students, and that's part of a program called Respectful Relationships. Jamie, I guess after listening to that, the evidence is pretty overwhelming in favour of these, of teaching people sexual consent, and even teaching consent from a very young age.
Totally.
I find it pretty interesting, though, that teachers are still quite reluctant to teach this curriculum about same-sex relationships, though. They're a bit worried about backlash from the media and then also from parents.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I remember when I was in high school way back a billion years ago, they did not touch on same-sex relationships at all.
No, not at all. Oh, my God, it's so heterosexual, you know, and heteronormative, absolutely.
And they still are a bit reluctant to, even in 2021.
And it comes from fear. It's, you know, it's fear-based. It's something that will be a sticky situation for a lot of people involved if they feel a bit uncomfortable about it, but the only way out is through. And so, like, obviously there's going to have to be all of these uncomfortable conversations going on. I
love that Sharon and Kirsty also really spoke about consent really being taught from primary school.
Yeah.
Like, these are like
so important.
Sexual consent, obviously you're not going to teach like a 5-year-old about this, but you're going to teach a 5-year-old about sharing, about being respectful to someone else on the playground, about making sure that you're not being too rough with someone on the playground.
Absolutely.
These lessons need to be taught early and these boundaries need to be established early. So
Absolutely.
that once you get to the point where you are talking to these teenagers about sex, they don't have to learn these things from pornography.
They understand it.
And they understand the general concept behind consent before they're just thrust into the world.
100%. Thrust into the world. Pun intended. Segue.
Anyway, thank you so much for that story, Hamish. Next, Wavelength explains the latest scandal to hit our defence force. But right now, you're listening to Fresh.
Wavelength.
Welcome back to Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having. David and Jamie with you tonight.
Right now, we've got a weekly segment called Wavelength Explains. This week, Andrew is going to explain the latest scandal to hit our defence force.
Wavelength Explains on Fresh 92.7.
You may have heard the name Ben Roberts-Smith being thrown around in the news in the last few weeks. Just in case the name doesn't ring a bell, Roberts-Smith is a recipient of Australia's highest military honour, the Victoria Cross, for his services while fighting in Afghanistan. Sounds like a hero, right? Well, back in 2018, details emerged of alleged war crimes dating back to 2012, including the alleged murder of a civilian that he was involved in. At the time, Mr. Roberts-Smith strenuously denied the allegations, saying they were, quote, completely without any foundation in truth. He's even going as far as to sue the newspapers involved for defamation. However, the chairman of a certain major media organisation has reportedly been funding the veterans' legal fight. Now, you may be asking, why is Roberts-Smith back in the news again all of a sudden? Well, last week saw a TV program report that he'd been burying drone vision of military operations in Afghanistan in his very own backyard. Naturally, a lawyer for the veteran has again denied the allegations. However, that hasn't stopped the Australian Federal Police from opening an investigation into the issue. The defamation trial itself is due to begin in early June. All this comes as the Defence Force struggles with other allegations of war crimes which emerged in November last year. The reports come from a 4-year-long inquiry which found credible evidence that prisoners, farmers or civilians were killed by ADF personnel. But we're not actually the only ones in the spotlight, with US war crimes also expected to be investigated by the International Criminal Court. So that's just a basic look into the story, but no doubt the legal process will be a big story in the months to come. As well as any outcomes of police investigations, this story looks like it's definitely one to watch.
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
That there was Andrew explaining the latest scandal to hit our defence force. You're listening to Fresh 92.7.
Wavelength.
Welcome back to Wavelength, sparking the conversations about Adelaide you should be having.
Right now, we've got our favourite weekly segment called Heaps Good News. This week, Art has got the goods for us.
Heaps Good News on Wavelength.
Hey guys, it's that time for our favourite part of the show where we go out and find happy and positive news to cap off your night after hearing about the sad and soul-crushing state of the world. So first up, of course, is the opening of the Trans-Tasman bubble, with the first flights between Australia and New Zealand landing throughout today. This is such good news, not only for the economy, but also to bring back a sense of normality back to our lives. This time last year, we couldn't even leave our houses, and now we can dip in and out of the country and not even have to quarantine. Personally, I'm hoping to get some time off and hitting the slopes up in New Zealand. In sporting news, a new national record was set at the Australian Track and Field Championships in Sydney. High jumper Nicola McDermott cracked the 2-metre mark yesterday, beating out her rival's previous record by 1 centimetre. McDermott is the first female to break the 2-metre barrier and is already qualified for the Olympics. In a world first, a prenatal scanning program kicked off today in Adelaide to help cut down on the number of premature births. The South Australian Health and Medical Research Institute, SAMRI, will be monitoring women's omega-3 levels after finding a causal link between pregnant women's omega-3 levels and premature birth rates. SA Pathology Clinical Service Director Tom Dodd said that pregnant women with low concentrations of omega-3 are more likely to have an early birth. And he said that early detection meant that women could be provided with an appropriate supplement to help reduce that likeliness. Now, over the weekend, as Prime Minister Scott Morrison was attending an event here in South Australia, he was flipped off by a man mid-speech. The PM has been flipped off in as many weeks with another young boy who gave the Prime Minister the bird at Kings Park in Western Australia. The Prime Minister's popularity has been plummeting ever since the sexual misconduct surrounding Parliament came to light. And now, while it is unfortunate that the highest office in the land has been receiving such flack, we should all be glad we live in such a democratic society that allows us to give that office the finger. And that's the good news for this week. Back to you, David.
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
Anyway, thank you so much for that, Arj. But that brings us to the end of tonight's show. Thank you guys for listening, Adelaide.
Make sure you subscribe to the Wavelength podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. You can listen back to our old episodes right now, and you'll be the first to know when tonight's episode goes up.
Absolutely, that is right. Thank you so much for joining me this week, Jamie, chatting sexual consent, chatting drugs. What a show.
All the things. I know. I'm loving the show this week. This is a saucy one.
It was a saucy one. We'll see you guys next Monday. Or actually, no, we won't. It's a public holiday.
Oh, nice.
No show for a week. We'll see you guys in 2 weeks.
Woo, holidays.
You're listening to Fresh.
Wavelength.